Marcos Herrera had arrived in Dolores Hidalgo in 1977 with an old suitcase, a patched cassock, and an unwavering faith. He was barely 22 years old, his face full of hope and an almost naive idealism that was contagious to those who met him. He had been assigned to the parish of San Miguel de los Santos, a humble but fervent community, where the parishioners welcomed the young priest with open arms. Marcos quickly won the affection of the town. He organized open-air masses, visited the sick in their homes, and listened to young people with an attentiveness that contrasted with the rigidity of other clerics. For a time, he believed he had found his place in the world. Everything seemed aligned with his vocation until the Archbishop arrived. Celestino Vasquez was an almost mythical figure in the region, charismatic, influential, feared. He had built an image as a modern and committed spiritual leader, but his presence commanded something deeper than respect. When he arrived in February 1979, accompanied by two young seminarians, Miguel and Roberto, Marcos noticed a change in the parish's atmosphere. At first, he thought it was jealousy or insecurity on his part, but it took only a few days for the unease to turn into alarm. Miguel avoided eye contact. Roberto withdrew. Sometimes, during the early hours of the morning, muffled sobs could be heard behind closed doors. Something wasn't right, and Marcos, without yet realizing it, was about to cross a threshold of no return. The realization came one rainy night when Marcos got up to close the windows of the parish office. As he passed through the corridor that connected to the rooms, he heard a muffled noise, like a suppressed moan. He stopped. The next thing he heard was the unmistakable sound of a lock being opened and the Archbishop's voice muttering something incomprehensible. Instinctively, he hid behind a column and watched, in the shadows, a scene that would mark him forever. Roberto, his shirt torn, leaving the Archbishop's room head down. Vasquez followed him with a cold stare while locking the door. Marcos didn't need more. It wasn't rumors, it wasn't paranoia. It was real, and it was monstrous. If this part touched your heart, I ask you one thing: subscribe to the channel. Only then can we continue telling stories like this. For days, Marcos walked like a ghost. In his homilies, he stuttered. In the confessional, he could barely hear. The guilt of knowing and not acting ate away at him. He decided to confront Vasquez, still naive about the extent of the power he faced. He summoned him to the sacristy one afternoon, believing a conversation would suffice. But as soon as he hinted at what he had seen, the Archbishop changed his tone. He took a small knife from his cassock pocket, placed it on the table, and in a low but firm voice spoke of the consequences. Think of your mother, your sister. Do you think anyone would believe them if you turned up as crazy or dead? He said. Marcos understood that he was trapped. Silence was not an option. It was a sentence imposed with a knife and fear. Days later, a van took him without warning to a remote mountain village, under the pretext that he needed rest due to a nervous breakdown. There, isolated without access to telephone or mail, Marcos lived through the worst months of his life. The place was cold and damp, and hardly any news came from outside. The few parishioners who attended Mass barely looked at him, as if he had already arrived with a reputation for being unbalanced. The loneliness was so intense that he sometimes spoke out loud just to remember the sound of his own voice. Every night, he dreamed of Roberto's eyes and Miguel's trembling, and every morning, he woke up with the weight of his cowardice pressed into his chest. It was a letter that brought him back from that living grave. An envelope with no return address arrived with a handwritten note. Roberto is dead. He took his own life. And the horror continues now with the town's children. We can't take it anymore. Forgive me. Miguel. Marcos's hands trembled as he held it. He knew he had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. He tried once more. He wrote a letter to the bishopric, asking for help, pleading for an investigation. There was no response. Then he made a desperate decision. He would return to Dolores Hidalgo in secret. He would infiltrate the Archbishop's office, search for evidence, whatever there was, and deliver it to the press or anyone who would listen. If he was going to die, at least let it be for something just. Do you feel this cannot be forgotten? Then help us keep the memory alive. Subscribe now. The night he returned, Dolores Hidalgo seemed like a different city, more modern, noisier, but with the same bells that had woken him for years. He entered the old convent through a back door that still had a rusty, fragile lock. He knew exactly where to go. Vasquez's office. There, under a loose floorboard, he found a metal box containing envelopes, photographs, names, evidence, schedules, confession statements that should never have been written down, all carefully filed away. His stomach churned. He knew he had minutes before being discovered, but he couldn't help but read the names of 3 children from the town where he'd been exiled. He felt a pang of rage, and that rage gave him the courage he needed to act. He didn't make it out. A recently installed silent alarm alerted the guards. Within seconds, Vasquez stormed in. He violently confronted him, pushed him against a bookshelf, and demanded to know who he was working with. Marcos didn't respond. The Archbishop drew his knife again and slashed Marcos across the face with almost ritualistic precision, leaving a scar that bled continuously. It was at that moment, between pain and fear, that he managed to hit him with a lamp and stagger down the hallway. He didn't know if he would survive, but he managed to escape. With the documents hidden under his cassock, that facial wound became his cross and his amulet, proof that he had faced the monster and lived to tell the tale. Wounded and with nowhere safe to go, Marcos arrived bleeding at the home of his old friend, José Luis, a priest he had met at the seminary. José Luis, seeing him in that state, asked no questions. He treated him, hid him for weeks, and when he heard the whole truth, wept silently. They both knew that Marcos could not continue on with his life as himself. The church would not only persecute him, it would also discredit him, burying him in rumors of madness or betrayal. It was José Luis who proposed the unthinkable, faking his death. A road accident, with no body recovered, would be enough to close the case. Marcos hesitated but understood that it was the only way out. The plan was elaborate. They used a deceased homeless man with no family as the body and organized an intimate, closed casket ceremony. José Luis presented the falsified death certificate, and the few who attended, including some from the bishopric, accepted without question. After all, Father Marcos had been unstable for years. That same night, with a new identity, he moved to a coastal town under the name Esteban Ruiz. He grew a beard, dyed his hair gray, and adopted a distinct accent. He began his new life as a rural teacher, while José Luis, silent, continued his rise within the church with a single mission: to one day expose the truth from within. Life as Esteban Ruiz was anything but peaceful. Although the coastal town welcomed him warmly, Marcos lived with constant paranoia. Every time he heard a patrol car, he thought it was the end. He got used to walking alternate routes, always looking back and avoiding personal questions. He taught poor children, many of whom had never had a regular teacher. This gave him a new purpose, but also confronted him with his powerlessness. He knew what darkness could do to innocence, and yet he still had to remain silent. At night, he wrote letters to José Luis, which were sent through intermediaries, always changing the senders and routes, as if he were a war fugitive. The years passed, and with them, the wear and tear. José Luis, true to his word, gathered information. Every so often he sent him news: bishops who had fallen into scandal, priests who had been quietly transferred, testimonies that had been lost. Once, he even managed to intercept an internal file with sealed complaints, but none had prospered. The network was too powerful, too protected. In 1998, Marcos received an urgent letter. Miguel had been murdered. The official report said it was an assault, but the context was suspicious. Miguel had been working for years with an organization that helped victims of clerical abuse. He was the last voice from that past, and now it too had been silenced. Fear returned with a vengeance, but this time, so did anger. Marcos felt the weight of Miguel's death fall squarely on his shoulders. For weeks, he couldn't sleep. He reread every letter they'd exchanged, reviewed every line of the documents he still kept hidden in a double-decker compartment of his desk. He thought about turning himself in, about telling the truth, even if it meant his arrest or death. But José Luis insisted, "It's not time yet. We need something else." That hope kept him going, until 2007, when everything changed. A midnight call informed him that José Luis had died in Rome, apparently of a heart attack. But the priest who called quietly confessed it wasn't natural. He was about to present something to the Vatican. They silenced him. From that moment on, Marcos knew he was completely alone. His last link to the church hierarchy, to his former identity, and to any possibility of institutional redemption was gone. He thought about burning everything and truly disappearing, about leaving for another country, assuming another identity. But something inside him told him that if he did, history would be lost with him. The names of Roberto, Miguel, the village children, they would all be faceless shadows, victims without justice. So he decided to stay. He began to write his complete testimony in detail, with dates, names, places. He hid it in different places, in case someone ever found even part of it. He no longer wrote out of rage. He wrote from memory. More than 10 years passed in this active silence. Marcos grew old in solitude, his face tanned by the sun and the scar, still visible under his beard. He taught literature and ethics at a secondary school, and although his students respected him, no one really knew who he was. Sometimes, when they discussed issues of religion or justice, he would look away and purse his lips. He was afraid of dying and that no one would know what he had experienced, but he was also afraid of speaking out and unleashing a storm he no longer had the strength to face. It was in 2019, during a school talk on human rights, that his life changed again. A young priest, barely 30 years old, approached him at the end of the event. His name was Alejandro Mendoza. He was new to the diocese and had heard old stories about the missing father from Dolores Hidalgo. What caught his attention was the physical resemblance to an old portrait he found in the parish archives. There was something in Marcos's eyes that he couldn't forget. He asked him point blank if he knew Father Marcos Herrera. The old teacher, surprised but serene, replied, "Yes, I knew him very well." Alejandro returned the next day with more questions, and little by little, with caution and respect, he gained his trust. He was the first visitor Marcos had received in years. He offered him coffee, showed him old photos, and one afternoon, without further ado, said, "I am Marcos Herrera." Alejandro remained silent, processing what he had just heard. He didn't interrupt, didn't show exaggerated surprise or offensive hesitation. He just nodded slowly and said, "I'm here to listen." From that moment on, Marcos began to tell everything. For weeks, they met in the small living room of his house, tape recorder in hand, going over every year, every name, every place. Alejandro vowed to verify every piece of information, every document. He soon discovered that many of the people mentioned in Marcos's testimony were still alive, although holding different positions or already retired. Some children mentioned in the files were now adults who, when contacted, burst into tears. The horror was real. It wasn't an isolated story. With the help of a network of independent lawyers and journalists, Alejandro began to build a solid case. It wasn't just the testimony of an old hidden man, but physical evidence, internal documents, victims willing to talk. The hardest part was keeping the investigation secret. They knew that if it reached the ears of certain authorities, everything could be silenced prematurely. Marcos, meanwhile, seemed to regain strength. He no longer walked hunched over or lowered his voice. He began to go out more often, to smile without fear. He even returned to celebrating Mass privately, just for Alejandro and himself, as a healing ritual. For the first time in 40 years, he felt that faith was not a prison, but a refuge. The decision to go public wasn't easy. Marcos feared for Alejandro's safety, for possible reprisals, for reliving the pain of those who had managed to survive the past in silence. But he also knew time was running out. His health was beginning to deteriorate, and the nights were growing colder. It was then that he recorded one last video, looking directly into the camera, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Marcos Herrera. I faked my death to survive, but today I choose to live so that the truth will not die." That recording was sent to several media outlets with clear instructions. It should only be released when the evidence was secure and the victims protected. It was a bombshell, but a necessary one. If you've made it this far, please subscribe. These stories need a place to continue to exist. The publication was a seismic event. National and international media took up the story of the resurrected priest. The Diocese of Dolores Hidalgo attempted to downplay the events, calling them baseless fables, but the weight of the documents and testimonies was overwhelming. Some priests confessed to having suspected something for years, others denied everything. The Vatican remained silent, but for the victims, the silence no longer mattered. The truth had come to light. Miguel, Roberto, the village children were no longer forgotten names. They were part of a story that finally had a face and a voice. Alejandro, for his part, became an uncomfortable figure within the church, but also a symbol of courage for many young priests who no longer wanted to remain silent. In the wake of the revelation, independent investigations were launched in several dioceses across the country. Old cases were reopened, sealed files were demanded by the courts, and a citizen movement pushed for the creation of a national commission on abuse in religious institutions. Although many of those directly responsible were already dead or retired, the echo of their crimes began to crumble, structures of impunity that seemed eternal. Marcos watched everything from his corner of the world, receiving letters, calls, and even visits from people who simply wanted to thank him for speaking out. Some nights he cried silently, not out of pain, but out of relief. Finally, the burden was not his alone. Finally, others carried it as well. But not everything was hopeful. Marcos received anonymous threats, letters with no return address, messages like, "The dead should stay dead," or "You made a mistake by coming back." His house was broken into once, though nothing was stolen. Alejandro was abruptly transferred to a parish in another state without formal explanation. Still, they didn't stop. They continued documenting testimonies, supporting victims, and participating in forums on justice and memory. For Marcos, the battle was no longer against Vasquez or the leaders who protected him. It was against oblivion, against the silence that allowed everything to happen again. At 70, he understood that he might not see complete justice in his lifetime, but he had already sown something that not even death could eradicate. One winter afternoon, while organizing his papers, Marcos found an old photograph. Himself, Miguel, and Roberto in the chapel of San Miguel de los Santos, the three of them smiling, young, before the horror. He stared at the image for minutes, as if searching for answers in those innocent faces. Then, with trembling hands, he wrote on the back, "So that we never forget what we were and what they made us." He put the photo in an envelope and left it at the door of the local church, unsigned. The next day, the town priest found it and, without understanding the context, placed it on the side altar, where it remained as a silent symbol of redemption and memory. Alejandro, from his new post, stayed in touch. He called him every Sunday, shared news about the progress of the case, and told him how more young priests were beginning to speak out. Some had even cited Marcos's testimony as inspiration not to cover up, to protect the vulnerable. That made sense of it all. One night, while listening to Mass on the radio, Marcos was surprised to hear his name mentioned in a prayer of the faithful. It was a small Catholic station, and someone had prayed for Father Marcos Herrera that his testimony may continue to illuminate paths of truth. In that instant, he knew he was no longer a ghost. His name existed again, not as a scandal but as hope. Marcos's final years were marked by a simple routine: morning walks on the beach, occasional classes for high school students, and long afternoons writing in his notebooks. He didn't have social media, television, or a cell phone. He preferred the radio and old books. Every so often someone would knock on his door. A journalist, a survivor, a young priest who had come from afar just to thank him. He would welcome them with hot tea, listen in silence, and then, with a discreet smile, hand them a bound copy of his testimony. "Take it, tell it, multiply it," he would say. He wasn't seeking fame. He just wanted the horror not to be repeated. Despite the threats, he never wanted to go back into hiding. "They can't kill me twice now," he told Alejandro during a phone call. His health, however, began to deteriorate. Respiratory problems, chronic fatigue, and a persistent cough followed him like an echo of the past. He knew the end was approaching, but he wasn't afraid. He had lived in too much fear for too long. Now, every day was a gift. One morning, when they didn't see him on his usual walk, the neighbors alerted the authorities. They found him at his desk, his head resting on an open notebook and a pen still between his fingers. He had died writing. His last sentence: "The truth didn't save me, but it set me free." The funeral was low-key, but well-attended. Although few knew who he had really been in life, many sensed that the man was hiding an important story. Alejandro traveled from his parish to officiate the Mass, and for the first time, he publicly called him by his real name. Today we say goodbye to Father Marcos Herrera, martyr of silence, uncomfortable witness to a truth the world needed to hear. Several attendees looked at each other surprised. Some cried without quite knowing why. Others, like the former students who were now adults, said goodbye with flowers and letters that they left beside his coffin. There were no cameras or media, only lit candles, broken voices, and a profound sense of poetic justice. In the following days, the video of his testimony began to circulate again, driven by communities fighting similar abuses. It was translated into several languages, shown at universities and human rights centers, and became study material for ethics and transitional justice seminars. Marcos's story became a symbol, not only within the church, but also outside it. It inspired laws, investigations, and a new whistleblower protection protocol within religious institutions. Although his face remained unknown to many, his voice, firm, worn but dignified, resonated in conference rooms, classrooms, and in hearts that, until then, had felt alone. A foundation was created in his name, Voz de Herrera. Its objective was clear: to accompany and protect those who dared to report abuses within religious power structures. Alejandro was one of its founders, along with lawyers, psychologists, and former victims who had found a spark of courage in Marcos's testimony. The headquarters were built in Dolores Hidalgo, ironically, just a few meters from the parish where it all began. The building, with its sober facade, housed an archive with all the original documents Marcos had collected, as well as recordings, letters, and personal objects that helped tell his story. It was a shrine of memory, built from scars. On Sundays, dozens of people came to the place, not only to get information, but to leave letters, testimonies, and lit candles. Some victims from other cities traveled there to sit in the small chapel on the second floor and find solace. On one of the walls, a hand-painted phrase summed it all up: "Silence kills, the truth saves." It was what Marcos had repeated for years, even when he thought no one was listening. In that space, his legacy grew. He was no longer just the man who faked his death. He was the voice of those who had never been heard. And even though his body lay buried underground, his story continued to germinate like a seed of justice in fertile soil. As time passed, more priests began to break the pact of silence. Some confessed to having been complicit out of fear. Others admitted to having remained silent out of misguided loyalty. The confessions didn't always come with names, but they did contain enough information to open new lines of investigation. We saw what happened to Marcos. We thought he was dead, and that fear paralyzed us, one of them confessed in a television interview. For the first time, the figure of the whistle-blowing priest was no longer seen as a traitor and was beginning to be recognized as someone brave, worthy of respect. This cultural transformation wasn't immediate, but it had begun, and Marcos, unknowingly, had driven it from exile. In some conservative circles, however, his story remained a forbidden topic. Despite the evidence, the public testimony, the confirmed victims, there were those who called him a heretic, a liar, and an instrument of the enemy. Alejandro received warnings for continuing to defend his legacy, and the foundation was the target of smear campaigns. But the difference now was that they were not alone. Independent media outlets, activists, and entire communities began to speak out in defense of the truth. Marcos was no longer just a name, he was a flag. And that flag waved in silent marches, in commencement speeches, and on the pages of newly published books. His story could no longer be erased, and that was his greatest triumph. In an interview conducted a year after his death, Alejandro recalled one of his last conversations with Marcos. They were sitting by the sea, gazing at the horizon, when the old man asked him, "Do you believe God forgave me?" Alejandro was silent for a moment, then replied, "I believe God cried with you all these years, and that he thanks you for not giving up." That phrase went viral when it was included in a documentary about the case. Many found in it a different way of seeing faith, not as blind obedience, but as a commitment to the truth, even when the institution fails. Marcos, without intending to, had changed the way many understood spirituality. Universities began to include his case in programs on law, religious ethics, and human rights. They studied not only the horror of what happened, but also the value of testimony, the power of repentance transformed into action, and the resilience of someone who lived for almost 3 decades in hiding without losing the essence of his mission. A renowned theologian described him as the modern Job who didn't curse, but didn't keep silent either. In student talks, young people repeated his name with admiration, as if he were an unlikely hero, and perhaps he was. Not for having confronted evil with violence, but for having chosen the most difficult path, to survive without forgetting. As more countries learned of Marcos's story, international organizations began to replicate the Voz de Herrera Foundation model. Support centers named after him emerged in Argentina, Chile, Spain, and the Philippines. Though tailored to each situation, they shared a common root: the conviction that institutional silence cannot override human suffering. At international conferences, his story was told as an example of resistance, not only against abuse, but also against indifference. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive had become a global network of hope and reparation. Alejandro, for his part, was called to testify before high-level church bodies. Many expected him to recant, to soften his story, but he stood firm. He brought with him the original writings of Mark, copies of the documents, and the testimonies of those still living. When a high-ranking Vatican official asked him if he wasn't afraid for his career within the church, he replied, "If being a priest means remaining silent in the face of injustice, then I prefer not to be one. But if it means accompanying those who suffer, as Jesus did, then I will be fulfilling my vocation." That phrase was quoted in media outlets around the world and marked a turning point in his pastoral career. Over time, Alejandro was reassigned to a parish on the outskirts of Mexico City, where he began working with marginalized communities. There, he found a new way to live his vocation, far from the trappings, but close to real pain. He organized support groups for survivors, offered simple masses, and gave open talks on previously taboo topics. In his office, there was always a framed photo of Marcos next to a lit candle. When someone asked him who he was, he would reply, "My teacher, not of theology, but of truth." In that poor neighborhood, far from the great cathedrals, Marcos's seed continued to bear fruit. Meanwhile, in Dolores Hidalgo, the former parish of San Miguel de los Santos was transformed into a cultural center. After years of public pressure, the building was deconsecrated and ceded by the diocese for community activities. Where once masses were celebrated, marked by complicit silence, concerts, plays, and historical memory workshops were now held. In one of its rooms, a small, permanent exhibition about Marcos Herrera was maintained, with recovered objects, excerpts from his diary, and audio testimonies. It was a living space, visited by schoolchildren, the curious, and pilgrims seeking truth. No one left there the same. Marcos's story touched them all, without exception. One day, an elderly woman approached the exhibit with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Roberto's sister. For years, she had believed her brother had taken his own life due to depression. Inexplicable sadness. No one had told her the truth. Reading the documents, hearing Marcos's voice narrating what had happened, she understood everything. She wept silently for hours, sitting in front of her brother's portrait. Then she left a note in the visitor's notebook. "Thank you for not letting him die in oblivion. Thank you for giving him back his name, his story, his dignity." That message was shared on social media and moved thousands. Letters also began to arrive from other countries, from people who had never met Marcos, but who identified with his story, with his pain, with his courage. Some shared abuses suffered in their childhood. Others spoke of silenced relatives, of secrets kept for decades. A young woman from Brazil wrote, "I didn't know men like him existed. I thought all priests were silent or looked the other way. Today, I have hope." Alejandro compiled many of these letters and began working on a book of testimonies inspired by Marcos's story. It wasn't a biography. It was a collective echo, a chorus of voices breaking the silence in unison, guided by the truth of a single man. The book, published under the title "He Who Dared to Speak," had an immediate impact. It was translated into more than 10 languages and presented at international fairs as a reference work on the fight against institutional abuse. It was not only a tribute, but also a tool for denunciation and training. In each chapter, Marcos's voice intertwined with that of other survivors, creating a collective account that was both moving and moving. Universities, NGOs, and progressive parishes began using it as part of their training programs. Some bishops openly criticized it. Others, however, distributed it silently, knowing that hiding it would perpetuate the wound. On the anniversaries of his death, small commemorative events were held across the country. In Dolores Hidalgo, children left flowers in front of a plaque that read, "Here Father Marcos Herrera served, suffered and endured. May his truth free us from silence." In Mexico City, Alejandro organized a special mass without incense or solemnity, but full of sincerity. On social media, thousands used the hashtag Marcos Herrera Vive to share stories of struggle, denunciation, and transformation. It was a kind of secular liturgy, where the martyr was not worshipped, but rather the possibility of living with dignity, even after the pain, was celebrated. His story lived on, like a flame that never goes out. Over the years, even some sectors of the church began to reconsider their positions. Roundtable discussions with victims were organized, stricter protocols for reporting abuse were implemented, and a reparation fund financed by historically designated dioceses was created. Although insufficient, it was a step. Some directly mentioned Marcos in these debates, acknowledging that his courage had initiated a process of transformation that could no longer be halted. Even cardinals who had once remained silent now cited his example as a wound that needed to be healed with truth. Quietly, yes, but they did it. And that, in that context, was already a miracle. In a posthumous interview included in a documentary, he is heard saying, "I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted to sleep peacefully." That simple and devastating phrase became a kind of motto among those fighting for justice, because in the end, that was what had driven Marcos from the beginning, the impossibility of living. Knowing what he knew, his impulse was not hatred or revenge, but the human need not to be complicit. In a society that often rewards silence and punishes those who speak out, he chose to pay the highest price so as not to betray himself. And although that price was loneliness, it was also the seed of a new collective consciousness. In schools, universities, and seminaries, his story began to be used not only as a warning, but as a moral guide. Ethics professors cited him as an example of integrity, while in journalism workshops, his case was analyzed as a lesson on the power of truth in the face of systems of power. Some students wrote essays, others composed songs, plays, even short films inspired by his life. Marcos Herrera gradually became more than just a figure of denunciation. He was a symbol of resistance, of faith without fanaticism, of compassion without weakness. A man who did not want to be a martyr, but whose memory could not help but become a beacon. One of the most moving moments occurred during a school play in Dolores Hidalgo. Sixth graders reenacted scenes from his life, from his arrival at the parish to the final recording of his testimony. When the moment arrived where Marcos's character said, "The truth didn't save me, but it set me free," the entire audience rose to applause. Many wept. Some silently held hands. Among the audience was the principal of the school that had welcomed him into her life as Esteban Ruiz. With tears in her eyes, she told, "Oh, reporter, I never imagined that the quiet teacher who taught ethics classes would be remembered for changing so many lives." And she was right. At that same school, the Week of Truth was established every year, dedicated to reflecting on the value of speaking out, memory, and justice. Each generation of students read excerpts from Marcos's testimony, analyzed the contexts of abuse of power, and wrote personal commitments to integrity. It was a way to keep his teachings alive, without idealizing him, remembering that he was a human being with fears, doubts, mistakes, but who chose to act. This normalization of everyday courage was perhaps his greatest legacy. He wasn't a Superman, he was one of us. And if he could face the darkness, others could too. Don't let this truth be lost. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with anyone who needs to hear it. Alejandro, already with prematurely gray hair and a serene gaze, never stopped talking about Marcos. He mentioned him in homilies, at interfaith gatherings, in conversations with young people who felt the church had failed them. He never asked for him to be canonized or elevated to a saint, only that he be remembered fairly. Because he didn't run away from pain, he said. He faced it to the very end, even though no one applauded. On one occasion, he was asked what Marcos would think of everything his testimony had generated. Alejandro smiled nostalgically and said he would surely be surprised. And then he would say that the important thing is not his name, but what we did with him. Because in the end, what Marcos left behind wasn't fame, it was purpose. Over the years, Marcos Herrera's story even reached non-Catholic religious communities who saw in his experience both a warning and an inspiration. Interfaith symposiums were organized to address spiritual and physical abuse in various institutions, and his name appeared as a starting point in many discussions. What had begun as a local tragedy transformed into a global movement for accountability. Not everyone wanted to hear it, of course, but they could no longer ignore it. His testimony had broken through the siege, and the most powerful thing was that it hadn't been with shouts or weapons, but with persistent truth and silent living. Even in Rome, where figures like Vasquez had been protected for years, some young prelates began to study his case. A group of Italian seminarians proposed naming a library of moral theology after him. Although the proposal failed to officially prosper, the gesture was symbolically powerful. It showed that the new generations did not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Marcos Herrera became a symbol of something deeper than denunciation, a courageous, committed spirituality, unafraid to say this is wrong, even if it costs one's place, reputation, or life. He, who had spent so much time in hiding, now inspired those just beginning their journey. In a letter found years later among his belongings, written but never sent, Marcos spoke directly to God. "I don't know if I did the right thing all the time. I doubted, I was afraid, I lied. But I tried not to let you down. And if you gave me this cross, it was so that I wouldn't allow others to carry it in silence. Forgive me for running away, but also for returning." That intimate and heartbreaking letter was published with the consent of his family and became one of the most widely read texts in religious and secular circles. Because he didn't speak from perfection, but from the most honest vulnerability, and therein lay his strength. One of Marcos's nephews, upon learning everything years later, decided to enter the seminary, not out of family tradition, but out of conviction. "I want to be the kind of priest my uncle silently was," he said. His ordination was simple, without great ceremony, but with a special moment. During the homily, he mentioned his uncle and all those who had been unjustly silenced. "Today I take up this vocation with open eyes, without romanticism, but with faith that we can do better." At the end of the Mass, he placed a small wooden cross on the altar with the initials MH engraved on it. No one needed an explanation. Everyone knew whose place in history belonged. In some villages, his story became part of oral tradition. Grandmothers told their grandchildren that there was once a priest who disappeared to save others and who returned from oblivion to tell the truth. The stories weren't always accurate, but the spirit remained intact. The courage to speak, to resist, to protect. Murals of his face began to appear on the walls of schools, libraries, and community centers, accompanied by phrases like, "Silence gives consent," or "Truth has scars," but also light. Thus, without official monuments, without ecclesiastical honors, Marcos took an indelible place in the collective consciousness. A journalist, writing a book about his case, attempted to summarize his legacy in a single sentence. After reviewing hundreds of pages, listening to hours of recordings, and speaking with dozens of people, she wrote, "Marcos didn't change the world, but he changed the course of many lives. And sometimes, that's more important." That phrase was included on a plaque installed in front of the Voz de Herrera Foundation archive. Every time someone visited the site, those words were the first thing they read. Because it wasn't about glorifying him, but about understanding that the power of a single voice, honest, brave, and determined, can ignite many others, even when it has been silenced for years. Over time, even those who had doubted his story began to recognize its value. Some former seminary classmates wrote letters asking for forgiveness, confessing that they had believed the official versions out of fear or convenience. Others admitted that, seeing him disappear, they thought he had abandoned his vocation out of weakness. "We didn't know he was carrying alone a truth that belonged to us all," read one of those letters. Marcos never read them, but those close to him decided to preserve them as proof that, even if it takes time, some hearts are awakened. Because his story wasn't just about abuse, it was also about collective cowardice and the possibility of redemption. Years later, during an international symposium in Geneva on restorative justice, the Marcos Herrera case was mentioned as an example of individual integrity in the face of corrupt systems. A young activist summed up his impact clearly. He had no army, no money, no platform. He only had the truth, and with that, he moved mountains that many believed were immovable. In that room, where dozens of different languages were spoken, his name was heard with respect, not for what he suffered, but for what he built from that suffering. Because although he didn't live to see it all, he left deep roots. And from those roots, voices continued to emerge that no longer accepted silence as an option. At the closing of that symposium, a short video was shown with images of Marcos, walking along the beach, writing in his notebook, smiling shyly at the camera. The voiceover was his own, taken from one of his last recordings. "If one day someone finds these words, I hope they remember me not for what I kept quiet, but for what I finally dared to say. I'm not an example of anything, just a man who could no longer hide." At the end of the video, there was a profound silence, followed by a long, heartfelt applause. It wasn't admiration, it was gratitude for having spoken, for having resisted, for not having given up. Alejandro, present in the room, couldn't hold back his tears. He knew his mentor's story had reached farther than either of them could have imagined. Upon returning to Mexico, he wrote in his diary, "Marcos is no longer here, but his voice walks with me, and as long as I have the strength, I will continue to repeat it." Thus, he fulfilled the promise he had once made to him, back when he had still secretly called him master. Because even as the years pass, even as structures change, there will always be those who try to silence the truth. And there will always be a need for a voice that dares to break that silence. Marcos's was one, but it paved the way for many more. Today, Marcos Herrera's name appears in books, documentaries, classrooms, and prayers. Not as a symbol of scandal, but as a testament to what happens when someone refuses to be an accomplice. His story is not perfect, nor free of contradictions, but it is profoundly human. He showed that even in the midst of fear, threat, and isolation, it is possible to choose the truth. That courage doesn't always scream. Sometimes it writes in silence for decades. That faith is not blind obedience, but a commitment to justice, even when it hurts. And that the most powerful legacy is one that inspires others to act with dignity. And so, 40 years after faking his death, Marcos returned to life, not in the flesh, but in words, in actions, in memory. He returned in every person who dared to speak for the first time, in every protected child, in every priest who chose not to remain silent, in every community that now listens, that now believes, that now acts. His story, painful, long, silent, was not in vain, because silence kills, but the truth, even if late, liberates. And Marcos Herrera, that priest who disappeared to protect others, is no longer alone. His voice, at last, belongs to the world. If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing. Every subscription allows us to continue raising voices the world tried to silence.